The Terra Nova Expedition, officially the British Antarctic Expedition, was an expedition to Antarctica which took place between 1910 and 1913. It was led by Robert Falcon Scott and had various scientific and geographical objectives. Scott wished to continue the scientific work that he had begun when leading the Discovery Expedition to the Antarctic in 1901–04. He also wanted to be the first to reach the geographic South Pole. He and 4 companions attained the pole on January 17, 1912, where they found that a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen had preceded them by 34 days. Scott's entire party died on the return journey from the pole. Some of their bodies, journals, and photographs were found by a search party 8 months later. The expedition, named after its supply ship, was a private venture, financed by public contributions augmented by a government grant. It had further backing from the Admiralty, which released experienced seamen to the expedition, and from the Royal Geographical Society. The expedition's team of scientists carried out a comprehensive scientific program, while other parties explored Victoria Land and the Western Mountains. An attempted landing and exploration of King Edward VII Land was unsuccessful. A journey to Cape Crozier in June and July 1911 was the first extended sledging journey in the depths of the Antarctic winter. For many years after his death, Scott's status as tragic hero was unchallenged, and few questions were asked about the causes of the disaster which overcame his polar party. In the final quarter of the 20th century the expedition came under closer scrutiny, and more critical views were expressed about its organization and management. The degree of Scott's personal culpability, and more recently, the culpability of certain expedition members, remains a matter of controversy among commentators. Preparations. Background. After Discovery's return from the Antarctic in 1904, Scott eventually resumed his naval career, but continued to nurse ambitions of returning south, with a conquest of the pole as his specific target. The Discovery Expedition had made a significant contribution to Antarctic scientific and geographical knowledge, but in terms of penetration southward had reached only 82 degrees 17 feet and had not traversed the Great Ice Barrier. In 1909 Scott received news that Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition had narrowly failed to reach the pole. Starting from a base close to Scott's Discovery anchorage in McMurdo Sound, Shackleton had crossed the Great Ice Barrier, discovered the Beardmore Glacier route to the polar plateau, and had struck out for the pole. He had been forced to turn for home at 88 degrees 23 feet s, less than 100 geographical miles from his objective. Scott had claimed prescriptive rights to the McMurdo Sound area, describing it as his own field of work, and Shackleton's use of the area as a base was in breach of an undertaking he gave Scott not to do so. This soured relations between the two explorers, and increased Scott's determination to surpass Shackleton's achievements. As he made his preparations for a further expedition, Scott was aware of other polar ventures being planned. A Japanese expedition was being planned. The Australasian Antarctic Expedition under Douglas Mawson was to leave in 1911, but would be working in a different sector of the continent. Meanwhile, Roald Amundsen, a potential rival, had announced plans for an Arctic voyage. Personal. 65 men formed the shore-on-ships parties of the Terra Nova Expedition. They were chosen from 8,000 applicants, and included 7 Discovery veterans together with 5 who had been with Shackleton on his 1907–09 expedition. Lieutenant E.R. Evans, who had been the navigating officer on Morning, the Discovery Expedition's relief ship in 1904, was appointed Scott's second-in-command. He abandoned plans to mount his own expedition, and transferred his financial backing to Scott. Among the other serving Royal Navy personnel released by the Admiralty were Lieutenant Harry Pennell, who would serve as navigator and take command of the ship once the shore parties had landed, and 2 surgeon lieutenants, George Murray Levick and Edward L. Atkinson. XRN officer Victor Campbell, known as the Wicked Mate, was one of the few who had skills in skiing, and was chosen to lead the party that would explore King Edward VII Land. 2 non-Royal Navy officers were appointed, Henry Robertson Bowers, known as Birdie, who was a lieutenant in the Royal Indian Marine, and Lawrence Oates, an army captain from the 6th Dragoons. Oates, independently wealthy, volunteered his services to the expedition and paid £1,000 into its funds. The Admiralty also provided a largely naval lower deck, including the Antarctic veterans Edgar Evans, Tom Crean and William Lashley. Other seamen in the shore party included Patrick Keohane and Robert Ford, Thomas Clissold and Frederick Hooper. 2 Russians, Dmitry Drov and Anton Omolchenko, also landed. To head his scientific program, Scott appointed Edward Wilson as chief scientist. Wilson was Scott's closest confidant among the party. On the Discovery expedition he had accompanied Scott on the farthest south march to 80°S. As well as being a qualified medical doctor and a distinguished research zoologist, he was also a talented illustrator. His scientific team which Scott's biographer David Crane considered as impressive a group of scientists as had ever been on a polar expedition included some who would enjoy later careers of distinction, George Simpson the meteorologist, Charles Wright, the Canadian physicist, and geologists Frank Debenham and Raymond Priestley T. Griffith Taylor, the senior of the geologists, biologist Edward W. Nelson and assistant zoologist Apsley Cherry Garrard completed the team. Cherry Garrard had no scientific training, but was a protégé of Wilson's. He had, like Oates, contributed £1,000 to funds. After first being turned down by Scott, he allowed his contribution to stand, which impressed Scott sufficiently for him to reverse his decision. Scott's biographer David Crane describes Cherry Garrard as the future interpreter, historian and conscience of the expedition. Herbert Ponting was the expedition's photographer, whose pictures would leave a vivid visual record. On the advice of Fridtjof Nansen, Scott recruited a young Norwegian ski expert, Trygve Gran. Transport. Scott had decided on a mixed transport strategy, relying on contributions from dogs, motor sledges and ponies. He appointed Cecil Mears to take charge of the dog teams, and recruited Shackleton's former motor specialist, Bernard Day, to run the motor sledges. Oates would be in charge of the ponies, but as he could not join the expedition until May 1910, Scott instructed Mears, who knew nothing of horses, to buy them with unfortunate consequences for their quality and performance. A polarized motor car had been unsuccessfully tried in the Antarctic by Shackleton, on his 1907-09 expedition, while his pioneering use of ponies had transported him as far as the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. Scott believed that ponies had served Shackleton well, and he thought he could resolve the motor traction problem by developing a tracked snow motor. However, Scott always intended to rely on man-hauling for the polar plateau, believing it impossible to ascend the Beardmore Glacier with motors or with animals. The motors and animals would be used to haul loads only across the barrier, enabling the men to preserve their strength for the later glacier and plateau stages. In practice, the motor sledges proved only briefly useful, and the ponies' performance was affected by their age and poor condition. As to dogs, while Scott's experiences on Discovery had made him dubious of their reliability, his writings show that he recognized their effectiveness in the right hands. As the expedition developed, he became increasingly impressed with their capabilities. Finance. Unlike the Discovery expedition, where fundraising was handled jointly by the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society, the Terra Nova Expedition was organized as a private venture without significant institutional support. Scott estimated the total cost at £40,000, half of which was eventually met by a government grant. The balance was raised by public subscription and loans. The expedition was further assisted by the free supply of a range of provisions and equipment from sympathetic commercial firms. The fund-raising task was largely carried out by Scott, and was a considerable drain on his time and energy, continuing in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand after Terra Nova had sailed from British waters. By far the largest single cost was the purchase of the ship Terra Nova, for £12,500. Terra Nova had been in Antarctica before, as part of the second Discovery relief operation. Scott wanted to sail her as a naval vessel under the White Ensign. To enable this, he obtained membership of the Royal Yacht Squadron for the sum of £100. He was thus able to impose naval discipline on the expedition, and as a registered yacht of the squadron, Terra Nova became exempt from Board of Trade regulations which might otherwise have deemed her unfit to sail. Objectives. Scott defined the objects of the expedition in his initial public appeal. The main objective of this expedition is to reach the South Pole, and to secure for the British Empire the honour of this achievement. There were other objectives, both scientific and geographical. The scientific work was considered by Chief Scientist Wilson as the main work of the expedition. No one can say that it will have only been a pole hunt. We want the scientific work to make the bagging of the pole merely an item in the results. Wilson hoped to continue investigations, begun during the Discovery Expedition, of the penguin colony at Cape Crozier, and to fulfill a program of geological, magnetic and meteorology studies on an unprecedented scale. There were further plans to explore King Edward VII Land, a venture described by Campbell, who was to lead it, as the thing of the whole expedition, and Victoria Land. First season, 1910 €11. Voyage out. Terra Nova sailed from Cardiff, Wales, on June 15, 1910. Scott, detained by expedition business, sailed later on a faster passenger liner and joined the ship in South Africa. In Melbourne, Australia, he left the ship to continue fundraising, while Terra Nova proceeded to New Zealand. Waiting for Scott in Melbourne was a telegram from Amundsen, informing Scott that the Norwegian was proceeding south. The telegram was the first indication to Scott that he was in a race. When asked by the press for a reaction, Scott replied that his plans would not change and that he would not sacrifice the expedition's scientific goals to win the race to the pole. In his diary he wrote that Amundsen had a fair chance of success, and perhaps deserved his luck if he got through. Scott rejoined the ship in New Zealand, where additional supplies were taken aboard, including 34 dogs, 19 Siberian ponies and 3 motorized sledges. Terra Nova, heavily overladen, finally left Port Chalmers on November 29, 1910. During the first days of December the ship was struck by a heavy storm. At one point, with the ship taking heavy seas and the pumps having failed, the crew had to bail her out with buckets. The storm resulted in the loss of 2 ponies, a dog, 10 imperial tons of coal and 65 imperial gallons of petrol. On December 10 Terra Nova met the southern pack ice and was halted, remaining for 20 days before breaking clear and continuing southward. The delay, which Scott attributed to sheer bad luck, had consumed 61 tons of coal. Cape Evans Base. Arriving off Ross Island on January 4, 1911, Terra Nova scouted for possible landing sites around Cape Crozier at the eastern point of the island, before proceeding to McMurdo Sound to its west, where both Discovery and Nimrod has previously landed. After Scott had considered various possible wintering spots, he chose a cape remembered from the Discovery days as the Scuari, about 15 miles north of Scott's 1902 base at Hut Point. Scott hoped that this location, which he renamed Cape Evans after his second-in-command, would be free of ice in the short Antarctic summer, enabling the ship to come and go. As the seas to the south froze over, the expedition would have ready access over the ice to Hut Point and the barrier. At Cape Evans the shore parties disembarked, with the ponies, dogs, the 3 motorized sledges, and the bulk of the party's stores. Scott was astonished at the strength of the ponies as they transferred stores and materials from ship to shore. A prefabricated accommodation hut, measuring 50 feet x 25 feet, was erected and made habitable by January 18. Amundsen's camp. Scott's program included a plan to explore and carry out scientific work in King Edward VII Land, to the east of the barrier. A party under Campbell was organized for this purpose, with the option of exploring Victoria Land to the northwest if King Edward VII Land proved inaccessible. On January 26, 1911 Campbell's party left in the ship and headed east. After several failed attempts to land his party on the King Edward VII Land shore, Campbell exercised his option to sail to Victoria Land. On its return westward along the barrier edge, Terra Nova encountered Amundsen's expedition camped in the Bay of Whales, an inlet in the Barrier. Amundsen was courteous and hospitable, willing for Campbell to camp nearby and offering him help with his dogs. Campbell politely declined, and returned with his party to Cape Evans to report this development. Scott received the news on February 22, during the first depot-laying expedition. According to Cherry Garrard, the first reaction of Scott and his party was an urge to rush over to the Bay of Whales and have it out with Amundsen. However, Scott recorded the event calmly in his journal. "One thing only fixes itself in my mind. The proper, as well as the wiser, course is for us to proceed exactly as though this had not happened. To go forward and do our best for the honor of our country without fear or panic." Depot laying, 1911 The aim of the first season's depot laying was to place a series of depots on the Barrier from its edge down to 80°S, for use on the polar journey which would begin the following spring. The final depot would be the largest, and would be known as 1-ton depot. The work was to be carried out by 12 men, the 8 fittest ponies, and 2 dog teams. Ice conditions prevented the use of the motor sledges. The journey started on January 27, in a state of hurry bordering on panic, according to Cherry Garrard. Progress was slower than expected, and the ponies' performance was adversely affected because Oates was opposed to using Norwegian snowshoes and had left them behind at Cape Evans. On February 4 the party established Corner Camp, 40 miles from Hut Point, when a blizzard held them up for 3 days. A few days later, after the march had resumed, Scott sent the 3 weakest ponies home. As the depot-laying party approached 80°, Scott became concerned that the remaining ponies would not make it back to base unless the party turned north immediately. Against the advice of Oates, who wanted to go forward, killing the ponies for meat as they collapsed, Scott decided to lay 1-ton depot at 79°29'S, more than 30 miles short of its intended location. Scott returned to safety camp with the dogs, after risking his own life to rescue a dog team that had fallen into a crevasse. When the slower pony party arrived, one of the animals was in very poor condition and died shortly afterwards. Later, as the surviving ponies were crossing the sea ice near Hut Point, the ice broke up. Despite a determined rescue attempt, 3 more ponies died. Of the 8 ponies that had begun the depot-laying journey, only 2 returned home. Winter quarters, 1911 On April 23, 1911 the sun set for the duration of the winter months, and the party settled into the Cape Evans hut. Under Scott's naval regime the hut was divided by a wall made of packing cases, so that officers and men lived largely separate existences, scientists being deemed officers for this purpose. Everybody was kept busy. Scientific work continued, observations and measurements were taken, equipment was overhauled and adapted for future journeys. The surviving ponies needed daily exercise, and the dogs required regular attention. Scott spent much time calculating sledging rations and weights for the forthcoming polar march. The routine included regular lectures on a wide range of subjects, Ponting on Japan, Wilson on sketching, Oates on horse management and geologist Frank Debenham on volcanoes. To ensure that physical fitness was maintained there were frequent games of football in the half-light outside the hut. Scott recorded that Atkinson is by far the best player, but Hooper, P.O. Evans and Crean are also quite good. The South Polar Times, which had been produced by Shackleton during the Discovery expedition, was resurrected under Cherry Garrard's editorship. On June 6 the feast was arranged, to mark Scott's 43rd birthday. A second celebration on June 21 marked Midwinter Day, the day that marks the midpoint of the long polar night. Main expedition journeys, 1911 Euro 12. Northern Party After reporting Amundsen's arrival to Scott at Cape Evans, Campbell's Eastern Party became the Northern Party. On February 9, 1911 they sailed northwards, arriving at Robertson Bay, near Cape Adare on February 17, where they built a hut close to Norwegian explorer Carsten's Borchgrevink's old quarters. The Northern Party spent the 1911 winter in their hut. Their exploration plans for the summer of 1911 Euro 12 could not be fully carried out, partly because of the condition of the sea ice and also because they were unable to discover a route into the interior. Terra Nova returned from New Zealand on January 4, 1912, and transferred the party to the vicinity of Evans Cove, a location approximately 250 miles south of Cape Adair and 200 miles northwest of Cape Evans. They were to be picked up on February 18 after the completion of further geological work, but due to heavy pack ice, the ship was unable to reach them. The group, with meager rations which they had to supplement by fish and seal meat, were forced to spend the winter months of 1912 in a snow cave which they excavated on Inexpressible Island. Here they suffered severe privations, frostbite, hunger, and dysentery, with extreme winds and low temperatures, and the discomfort of a blubber stove in confined quarters. On April 17, 1912, a party under Edward Atkinson, in command at Cape Evans during the absence of the Polar Party, went to relieve Campbell's party, but were beaten back by the weather. The Northern Party survived the winter in their icy chamber, and set out for the base camp on September 30, 1912. Despite their physical weakness, the whole party managed to reach Cape Evans on November 7, after a perilous journey which included a crossing of the difficult Drygalski ice tongue. Geological and other specimens collected by the Northern Party were retrieved from Cape Adair and Evans Cove by Terra Nova in January 1913. Western Geological Parties First Geological Expedition, January-March 1911. The objective of this journey was geological exploration of the coastal area west of McMurdo Sound, in a region between the McMurdo Dry Valleys and the Kwiklet's Glacier. This work was undertaken by a party consisting of Griffith Taylor, Debenham, Wright and Edgar Evans. They landed from Terra Nova on January 26 at Butter Point, opposite Cape Evans on the Victoria Land shore. On January 30, the party established its main depot in the Ferrar Glacier region, and then conducted explorations and survey work in the Dry Valley and Taylor Glacier areas before moving southwards to the Kwiklet's Glacier. After further work there, they started homewards on March 2, taking a southerly route to Hut Point, where they arrived on March 14. Second Geological Expedition, November 1911 February 1912. This was a continuation of the work carried out in the earlier journey, this time centering on the Granite Harbour region approximately 50 miles north of Butter Point. Taylor's companions this time were Debenham, Grant and Ford. The main journey began on November 14, and involved difficult travel over sea ice to Granite Harbour, which was reached on November 26. Headquarters were established at a site christened Geology Point, and a stone hut was built. During the following weeks, exploration and surveying work took place on the Mackay Glacier, and a range of features to the north of the glacier were identified and named. The party was due to be picked up by Terra Nova on January 15, 1912, but the ship could not reach them. The party waited until February 5 before trekking southward, and were rescued from the ice when they were finally spotted from the ship on February 18. Geological specimens from both Western Mountains expeditions were retrieved by Terra Nova in January 1913. Winter journey to Cape Crozier. This journey was conceived by Wilson. He had suggested the need for it in the zoology section of the Discovery Expedition's scientific reports, and was anxious to follow up this earlier research. The journey's scientific purpose was to secure emperor penguin eggs from the rookery near Cape Crozier at an early embryo stage, so that particular points in the development of the bird could be worked out. This required a trip in the depths of winter to obtain eggs in an appropriately early stage of incubation. A secondary purpose was to experiment with food rations and equipment in advance of the coming summer's polar journey. Scott approved, and a party consisting of Wilson, Bowers and Cherry Garrard set out on June 27, 1911. Traveling during the Antarctic winter had not been previously tried. Scott wrote that it was a bold venture, but the right men have gone to attempt it. Cherry Garrard later described the horrors of the 19 days it took to travel the 60 miles to Cape Crozier. Gear, clothes, and sleeping bags were constantly iced up. On July 5, the temperature fell below 77 Fahrenheit to 109 degrees of frost to as cold as anyone would want to endure in darkness and iced-up clothes, wrote Cherry Garrard. Often the daily distance travelled was little more than a single mile. After reaching Cape Crozier on July 15 the party built an igloo from snow blocks, stone, and a sheet of wood they had brought for the roof. They were then able to visit the penguin colony and collect several emperor penguin eggs. Subsequently their igloo shelter was almost destroyed in a blizzard with force 11 winds. The storm also carried away the tent upon which their survival would depend during their return journey, but fortunately this was recovered, half a mile away. The group set out on the return journey to Cape Evans, arriving there on August 1. The 3 eggs that survived the journey went first to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, and thereafter were the subject of a report from Dr. Crosier Stewart at the University of Edinburgh. The eggs failed, however, to provide proof of Wilson's theories. Cherry Garrard afterwards described this as the worst journey in the world, and used this as the title of the book that he wrote in 1922 as a record of the entire Terra Nova Expedition. Scott called the winter journey a very wonderful performance, and was highly satisfied with the experiments in rations and equipment, "We are as near perfection as experience can direct." South Polar Journey On September 13, 1911, Scott revealed his plans for the South Pole March. 16 men would set out, using the 2 remaining motor sledges, ponies and dogs for the barrier stage of the journey, which would bring them to the Beardmore Glacier. At this point the dogs would return to base and the ponies would be shot for food. Thereafter, 12 men in 3 groups would ascend the glacier and begin the crossing of the polar plateau, using man-hauling. Only one of these groups would carry on to the pole. The supporting groups would be sent back at specified latitudes. The composition of the final polar group would be decided by Scott during the journey. For the return journey, Scott ordered that the dogs' teams set off again from the base camp to replenish depots and meet the polar party between latitude 82 and 82.30 on March 1 to assist the party home. The motor party started from Cape Evans on October 24 with 2 motor sledges, their objective being to haul loads to latitude 80 30 feet S and wait there for the others. By November 1 both motor sledges had failed after a little more than 50 miles of travel, so the party man-hauled 740 pounds of supplies for the remaining 150 miles, reaching their assigned latitude 2 weeks later. Scott's main party, which had left Cape Evans on November 1 with the dogs and ponies, caught up with them on November 21. Scott's initial plan was that the dogs would return to base at this stage. However, because of the slower-than-expected progress, Scott decided to take the dogs on further. Day and Hooper were dispatched to Cape Evans with a message to this effect for Simpson, who had been left in charge there. On December 4 the expedition had reached a gateway, the name given by Shackleton to the route from the barrier onto the Beardmore Glacier. At this point a blizzard struck, forcing the men to camp until December 9 and to break into rations intended for the glacier journey. When the blizzard lifted, the remaining ponies were shot as planned, and their meat deposited as food for the return parties. On December 11, Mears and Dimitri turned back with the dogs, carrying a message back to base that things were not as rosy as they might be, but we keep our spirits up and say the luck must turn. The party began the ascent of the Beardmore, and on December 20 reached the beginning of the polar plateau where they laid the upper glacier depot. There was still no hint from Scott as to who would be in the final polar party. On December 22, at latitude 85 20 feet S, Scott sent back Atkinson, Cherry Garrard, Wright and Keohane. Scott reminded Atkinson to take the 2 dog teams south in the event of Mears having to return home, as seemed likely to assist the polar party on its return journey the following March. The remaining 8 men continued south, in better conditions which enabled them to make up some of the time lost on the barrier. By December 30 they had caught up with Shackleton's 1908-09 timetable. On January 3, 1912, at latitude 87 32 feet S, Scott made his decision on the composition of the polar party. 5 men would go forward while Lieutenant Evans, Lashley and Crean would return to Cape Evans. The decision to take 5 men forward involved recalculations of weights and rations, since everything had been based on 4-man teams. The polar group continued towards the pole, passing Shackleton's furthest south on January 9. 7 days later, about 15 miles from their goal, Amundsen's black flag was spotted and the party knew that they had been forestalled. They reached the pole the next day, January 17, 1912, the pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God! This is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority. Well, it is something to have got here. Scott still hoped to race Amundsen to the telegraph cable head in Australia, now for a desperate struggle to get the news through first. I wonder if we can do it. However, on January 18, 1912 they discovered Amundsen's tent, some supplies, a letter to King Haakon VII of Norway and a note stating that Amundsen had arrived there with 4 companions on December 16, 1911. After confirming their position and planting their flag, Scott's party turned homewards. During the next 3 weeks they made good progress, Scott's diary recording several excellent marches. Nevertheless, Scott began to worry about the physical condition of his party, particularly of Edgar Evans, who was suffering from severe frostbite and was, Scott records, a good deal run down. The condition of Oates's feet became an increasing anxiety, as the group approached the summit of the Beardmore Glacier and prepared for the descent to the barrier. On February 7, they began their descent and had serious difficulty locating a depot. In a brief spell of good weather, Scott ordered a half-day's rest, allowing Wilson to geologize. 30 pounds of fossil-bearing samples were added to the sledges. These plant fossils are now known to prove the theory of continental drift. Edgar Evans's health was deteriorating. A hand injury was failing to heal, he was badly frostbitten, and is thought to have injured his head after several falls on the ice. He is absolutely changed from his normal self-reliant self, wrote Scott. Near the bottom of the glacier he collapsed, and died on February 17. On the barrier stage of the homeward march, Scott reached the 82.30 degree S meeting point for the dog teams, 3 days ahead of schedule, noting in his diary for February 27, 1912, "We're naturally always discussing possibility of meeting dogs, where and when, etc. It is a critical position. We may find ourselves in safety at the next depot, but there is a horrid element of doubt." The party then met with 2, ultimately critical, difficulties: a large, unexpected drop in temperature, and a worrying shortage of fuel in the depots. The low temperatures caused poor surfaces which Scott likened to pulling over desert sand. He described the surface as coated with a thin layer of woolly crystals, formed by radiation no doubt. These are too firmly fixed to be removed by the wind and cause impossible friction on the sledge runners. The low temperatures were accompanied by an absence of wind, something Scott had expected to assist them on their northern journey. The party were further slowed down by the frostbite in Oates' left foot. Daily marches were now down to less than 5 miles, which was insufficient given the lack of oil. Furthermore, by March 10 it became evident the dog teams were not coming. The dogs which would have been our salvation have evidently failed. Mears, the dog driver, had a bad trip home, I suppose. In a farewell letter to Sir Edgar Speyer, dated March 16, Scott wondered whether he had overshot the meeting point and fought the growing suspicion that he had in fact been abandoned by the dog teams. "We very nearly came through, and it's a pity to have missed it, but lately I have felt that we have overshot our mark. No one is to blame and I hope no attempt will be made to suggest that we had lacked support." On the same day, Oates, who now with hands as well as feet pretty well useless, voluntarily left the tent and walked to his death. Scott wrote that Oates' last words were, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." Oates' sacrifice increased the team's speed, but it was too late to save them, especially since Scott's right toes were now becoming frostbitten. Scott, Wilson and Bowers struggled on to a point 11 miles south of One Ton Depot, but were halted on March 20 by a fierce blizzard. Although each day they attempted to advance, they were unable to do so. Scott's last diary entry, dated March 29, 1912, the presumed date of their deaths, ends with these words. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. Last entry. For God's sake look after our people. Attempts to relieve the Polar Party, 1912. Orders concerning dogs. Before setting out on the South Pole journey, Scott had made arrangements intended to help the Polar Party home, with the use of dogs. Meares, who was expected to have returned to Cape Evans by December 19, had been instructed that in late December or early January he should transport to 1 Ton Depot 5 excess rations, excess equals extra summit ration, food for 4 men for 1 week, 3 cases of biscuit, 5 gallons of oil and as much dog food as you can conveniently carry. If this mission could not be carried out by dogs, then at all hazard a man-hauling team was to carry the excess rations to the depot. Meares had been further instructed that in about the first week in February, depending on news received from returning units, he should set out, with dogs, with a view to meeting the returning Polar Party between latitudes 82° or 82°30 on about March 1. The objective of these orders was to hasten the party back to Cape Evans before Terra Nova left, so that news of the polar conquest could be carried immediately to New Zealand. Scott placed greater emphasis on the former journey than on the latter. Whilst the object of your third journey is important, that of the second is vital. The substance of these orders was reiterated to Atkinson when he left Scott at the top of the Beardmore Glacier on December 22, 1911. Several events occurred to obscure and ultimately frustrate this order. The fact that Meares had turned back from the Polar March much later than originally planned meant that he did not return to Cape Evans until January 5. Huntford suggests he resigned at this point because he was disgusted with Scott's expedition. Evans in contrast quotes from a letter by Cherry Garrard in 1938 that Meares had been ready at Cape Evans to resupply 1 Ton Depot as ordered, when he had seen the ship arrive in the bay and so stayed at base. The ship however turned out to be a mirage, and the real ship did not arrive until the middle of February. According to Evans, Meares was preoccupied with his late father's estate, and was anxious to leave on the ship as soon as he could. 3 of the excess rations required for 1 Ton Depot had been man-hauled there by a party which left Cape Evans on December 26, but neither Meares nor anyone else transported the missing rations or the dog food to 1 Ton Depot. Atkinson's aborted journey to meet Scott. When Atkinson arrived back at Cape Evans from the Beardmore Glacier at the end of January, he was the senior officer present and thus in command of the base camp, a role to which he was not accustomed. Terra Nova arrived from her winter mooring in New Zealand on February 9, and instead of setting off for Scott, Atkinson used the shore party for the arduous task of unloading the ship. A mistake, Cherry Garrard thought, since these men might be required to sledge again. Belatedly, on February 13, Atkinson set out with Dmitry Drov and the dog teams for the scheduled meeting with Scott on the Barrier, arriving and pausing at Hut Point on February 19. Meanwhile, however, during the final returning party's journey, Lieutenant Evans had become seriously ill with scurvy. After 1 Ton Depot he was unable to march, and was carried on the sledge by Crean and Lashley to a point 35 miles south of Hut Point. At that point he appeared likely to die. On February 18, Crean walked on alone to reach Hut Point, where he found Atkinson and Dmitry with their dogs, pausing in their journey to meet Scott. Atkinson diverted his attention to the rescue of Evans, whom he brought to Hut Point, barely alive, on February 22. From that point, Atkinson's priority was to bring Evans to the safety of the ship. Cherry Garrard's journey to 1 Ton Depot with Atkinson thus occupied, an alternative arrangement to pick up Scott was necessary. Disregarding Meares, who was not available for work, the most qualified person available to meet Scott's party was the physicist Wright, an experienced traveler and navigator, but the chief scientist Simpson insisted Wright's scientific work be given priority. Atkinson therefore chose Cherry Garrard, who could however not navigate, had never handled a dog before and who was moreover short-sighted. Lieutenant Evans wrote later that he thought Scott would have approved the decision to keep Wright at the base camp, whereas Wright later stated, "It always worries me, I should have had that job." Cherry Garrard would be accompanied by Dimitri. In his 1922 book The Worst Journey, Cherry Garrard recalled the controversial verbal orders given by Atkinson. He was to travel to One Ton Depot as fast as possible, where he was to leave food for the returning polar party. If Scott had not arrived before him, Cherry Garrard should decide what to do. Atkinson also emphasized that this was not a rescue party, and added that Scott had given instructions that the dogs were not to be risked in view of the sledging plans for next season. In the standard edition of his book, Cherry omitted any mention of Scott's request to be picked up at 82° or 82°30 on March 1. But after Atkinson's and Lady Scott's deaths in 1929 and 1947 respectively, in a postscript to his privately published 1948 edition, Cherry acknowledged the existence of Scott's order and provided reasons why Atkinson, and later he himself, failed to comply. Cherry Garrard in 1948 stated that Atkinson was too exhausted at the beginning of February to set off to meet Scott, and that the lack of dog food at One Ton Depot made a timely start impractical. Karen May of the Scott Polar Research Institute goes further by suggesting that the instruction about saving the dogs for the following season was Atkinson's own invention. Cherry Garrard left Hut Point with Dimitri and 2 dog teams on February 26, arriving at One Ton on March 4 and depositing the extra rations. Scott was not there. With supplies for themselves and the dogs for 24 days, they had about 8 days' time before having to return to Hut Point. The alternative to waiting was moving southwards for another 4 days. Any travel beyond that, in the absence of the dog food depot, would mean killing dogs for dog food as they went along, thus breaching Atkinson's not to be risked order. Cherry Garrard argued that the weather was too poor for further travel, with daytime temperatures as low as 37° Fahrenheit, and that he might miss Scott if leaving the depot, and thus decided to wait for Scott. On March 10, in worsening weather, with his own supplies dwindling, Cherry Garrard turned for home. Meanwhile, Scott's team were fighting for their lives less than 70 miles away. Atkinson would later write, "I am satisfied that no other officer of the expedition could have done better." Cherry Garrard was troubled for the rest of his life by thoughts that he might have taken other actions that could have saved the polar party. Atkinson's final relief effort when Cherry Garrard returned from One Ton Depot without Scott's party, anxieties rose. Atkinson, now in charge at Cape Evans as the senior naval officer present, decided to make another attempt to reach the polar party when the weather permitted, and on March 26 set out with Keohane, man hauling a sledge containing 18 days' provisions. In very low temperatures they had reached Corner Camp by March 30, when, in Atkinson's view, the weather, the cold and the time of year made further progress south impossible. Atkinson recorded, "In my own mind I was morally certain that the polar party had perished." Search Party, October 1912. The remaining expedition members still at Cape Evans waited through the winter, continuing their scientific work. In the spring Atkinson had to consider whether efforts should first be directed to the rescue of Campbell's party, or to establishing if possible the fate of the polar party. A meeting of the whole group decided that they should first search for signs of Scott. The party set out on October 29, accompanied by a team of mules that had been landed from the Terra Nova during its resupply visit the previous summer. On November 12 the party found the tent containing the frozen bodies of Scott, Wilson and Bowers, 11 miles south of One Ton Depot. Atkinson read the relevant portions of Scott's diaries, and the nature of the disaster was revealed. After diaries, personal effects and records had been collected, the tent was collapsed over the bodies and a cairn of snow erected, topped by a cross fashioned from grand skis. The party searched further south for Oates's body, but found only his sleeping bag. On November 15, they raised a cairn near to where they believed he had died. On returning to Hut Point on November 25 the search party found that Campbell's northern party had rescued itself and had returned safely to base. Early in the morning of February 10, 1913, Dr. Edward Atkinson and Lieutenant Harry Pennell rowed into the New Zealand port of Oamarup, from where they sent a coded message back to the expedition's New Zealand agent, Joseph Kinsey, informing him of the fate of Scott and his party. Atkinson and Pennell then boarded a train to meet the Terra Nova in Leetelton near Christchurch. Aftermath. As Campbell was now the senior naval officer of the expedition, he assumed command for its final weeks, until the arrival of Terra Nova on January 18, 1913. Before the final departure, a large wooden cross was erected on the slopes of Observation Hill, overlooking Hut Point, inscribed with the 5 names of the dead and a quotation from Tennyson's Ulysses, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." The loss of Scott and his party overshadowed all else in the British public's mind, including Amundsen's feat in being first at the pole. For many years the image of Scott as a tragic hero, beyond reproach, remained virtually unchallenged, for although there were rifts among some who were close to the expedition, including relatives of those who died, this disharmony was not public. There was no real change in public perceptions until the 1970s, by which time nearly all those directly concerned with the expedition were dead. Controversy was ignited with the publication of Roland Huntford's book Scott and Amundsen. Huntford was critical of Scott's supposedly authoritarian leadership style and of his poor judgment of men, and blamed him for a series of organizational failures that led to the death of everyone in the Polar Party. Scott's personal standing suffered from these attacks. Efforts to restore his reputation have included the account by Ranulphans, Susan Solomon's scientific analysis of the weather conditions that ultimately defeated Scott, David Crane's 2005 biography of Scott, and Karen May's new analysis of Scott's disobeyed orders specifying that the dog teams transport his returning party swiftly back to the base camp. In comparing the achievements of Scott and Amundsen, most polar historians generally accept that Amundsen's skills with skiing dogs, his general familiarity with ice conditions, and his clear focus on a non-scientific expedition gave him considerable advantages in the race for the pole. Scott's verdict on the disaster that overtook his party, written when he was close to death, lists the initial loss of pony transport, weather conditions, a shortage of fuel in our depots for which I cannot account, and the sickening of Evans and Oates, but ultimately Scott concludes that our wreck is certainly due to this sudden advent of severe weather. On the barrier. A 30° Fahrenheit in the day, a 47° Fahrenheit at night. Presumably with regard to the failed rendezvous with the dog teams requested from March 1, 1912, Scott furthermore wrote, "No one is to blame and I hope no attempt will be made to suggest that we have lacked support." Cherry Garrard, whom Atkinson placed in charge of the dog teams which started late, failed to meet Scott and turned for home, observes that the whole business simply bristles with ifs. An accumulation of decisions and circumstances that might have fallen differently ultimately led to catastrophe. But we were as wise as anyone can be before the event. 31 years later, after suffering irreversible damage while carrying supplies to base stations in Greenland, the SS Terra Nova was set on fire and later sunk by gunfire off the southern coast of Greenland on September 13, 1943, at 60°15 euro squared 15 euro cubed N, 45°55 euro squared 45 euro cubed W. Its submerged remains were found in 2012. See also, comparison of Amundsen's South Pole expedition and the simultaneous Terra Nova expedition of Scott, heroic age of Antarctic exploration, list of Antarctic expeditions, Terra Nova. Notes and references, notes. References. Sources, Barkziewski, Stephanie. Antarctic Destinies, Scott, Shackleton in the Changing Face of Heroism. London, Hambledon Continuum. ISBN 978-84725-192-3. Cherry Garrard, Apsley, 1922. The Worst Journey in the World. London, Penguin Books. ISBN 978-0-14-009501-2. OCLC 16589938. Crane, David. Scott of the Antarctic, A Life of Courage, and Tragedy in the Extreme South. London, HarperCollins. ISBN 978-00-715068-7. OCLC 60793758. Evans, Edward A. Gr. Southwood Scott. London, Collins. Franz, Ranulf. Captain Scott. Hodder and Staunton Limited. ISBN 978-0-340-82697-3. Huntford, Roland. The Last Place on Earth. London, Pan Books. ISBN 978-0-330-28816-3. Huxley, Elspeth. Scott of the Antarctic. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. ISBN 978-0-297-77433-4. Huxley, Leonard, ed. Scott's Last Expedition, Volume I, being the Journals of Captain R. F. Scott, R.N., CVO London, Smith, Elder and Company. OCLC 1522514. Huxley, Leonard, ed. Scott's Last Expedition, Volume II, being the reports of the journeys and the scientific work undertaken by Dr. E. A. Wilson and the surviving members of the expedition. London, Smith, Elder and Company. OCLC 1522514. Lim, Sue. Cordingley, Patrick. Captain Oates, Soldier and Explorer. London, B. T. Batsford. ISBN 978-0-7134-2693-May 9, Karen. Could Captain Scott have been saved? Revisiting Scott's Last Expedition. Polar Record 49, 72 euro 90 doi, 10.1017 per second 0032247411000751. Retrieved July 6, 2014. Preston, Diana. A First-Rate Tragedy, Captain Scott's Antarctic Expeditions. London, Constable. ISBN 978-0-09-479530-3. OCLC 59395617. Riffenberg, Bo. Nimrod. London, Bloomsbury Publishing. ISBN 978-0-7475-7253-4. Seaver, George. Edward Wilson of the Antarctic. London, John Murray. Shackleton, Ernest. The Heart of the Antarctic. London, William Heinemann. Savers, Anne. Wilson, Edward Adrian. Oxford Dictionary of National Biography Online Edition. Oxford University Press. Retrieved May 8, 2015. Solomon, Susan. The Coldest March, Scott's Fatal Antarctic Expedition. New Haven, Yale University Press. ISBN 978-0-300-09921-8. Purchasing Power of British Pounds from 1264 to present. Measuring Worth. Retrieved October 12, 2011. Further reading, Bainbridge, Beryl. The Birthday Boys. Duckworth. ISBN 978-0-7156-2378-7. Franz, Ranulf. Race to the Pole, Tragedy, Heroism, and Scott's Antarctic Quest. Hyperion. ISBN 978-1-4013-0047-0. Hattersley Smith, G., ed. The Norwegian with Scott, The Antarctic Diary of Trygve Gran 1910 Euro 13. HMS OISBN 978-0-11-290382-6. Jones, Max. The Last Great Quest, Captain Scott's Antarctic Sacrifice. OUP. ISBN 978-0-19-280483-9. Lambert, K. The Longest Winter, The Incredible Survival of Captain Scott's Lost Party. Smithsonian Books. ISBN 978-58834-195-2. Ponting, H. G. The Great White South. Duckworth. External links: Ponting's original expedition film 90 Degrees South, south-pole.com, coolantarctica.com, the Antarctic Circle website and forum, Herbert Ponting Portfolio and Platinum Prints, the Antarctic Heritage Trust, Herbert Ponting Photographs, Herbert G. Ponting's Haunting Expedition Record a slideshow by the First Post, Project Gutenberg, The Worst Journey in the World by Apsley Cherry Garrard, Scott Polar Research Institute Daily Blog of Scott's Journal.